Welcome, everybody. I'm Greg Slobodkin, editor-in-chief of scienceboard.net. And as part of our continuing discussions with KOLs in the industry, I have the privilege today of having Janet Lambert, who is CEO of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicines. Janet, it's great to be speaking with you.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
So it was announced in late April that you're stepping down after 5 years at ARM. And so I just thought this was a great time for sort of an assessment of what's been achieved over the last 5 years under your leadership at ARM, and to sort of talk about the state of the industry, where we're at, and where we're going. So can we start there? I mean, what a tremendous ride over the last 5 years. I mean, growth for the industry, but also growth for ARM.
Yeah, it's been a sensational 5 years. It's just been a privilege to lead ARM through this period. As you said, it's been a really high growth period for the sector, and it's been a really high growth period for ARM. When I started, ARM had about 200 members and about half a dozen contract employee staff members, and we now have more than 425 member organizations and a team of almost 25 helping to support the work of the field in the US and Europe and around the world. So it's really been just a tremendous opportunity to kind of professionalize and grow the organization just at the time when the field, I think, really needed it. And it's just been great to work with the members to try to advance those initiatives that really can benefit the whole sector going forward.
And so, as we talk here, June 2022, I mean, how would you characterize the state of the industry?
Oh my gosh, I think the state of the industry is quite strong. I mean, it wouldn't be realistic to not comment on the fact that the financing environment right now is challenging. That a high interest environment always creates challenges for investors in biotech. And I think we're seeing that play out. So there's definite financing challenges for companies in the field. But I think that exists in the context of just incredible strength. This field has been on a real trajectory of investments. Just in the last year, we hit a record $22 billion, almost $23 billion of investment in the sector. That's on top of $20 billion the year before that, and $20 billion cumulatively in the 2 years before that. So together, we've had $60 billion flow into this field in the last 3 years. And that is, of course, fuel in the tank for all the scientific progress that we're trying to achieve. So now if you look at the field, you've got 2,400 clinical trials underway, half of those commercial, half academic. Almost 150 phase 3 trials where you really have therapies advancing through the early stages to where they could really realistically reach patients. You've got a breadth of indications being addressed. So not just rare diseases, but increasingly prevalent diseases of the, kind of cardiovascular, CNS diseases. So the field is really starting to mature and broaden. Another indication of that, you've got 1,200 companies around the globe now working in cell, gene, and tissue engineered therapies. And that's also growing. The field is still considerably concentrated in the United States. Probably a little bit more than half of those 1,200 companies are here. You've got a meaningful cohort of companies in Europe, and now increasingly you're seeing real growth in the field in APAC. So I think from the point of view of kind of the development of companies, the development of therapies, and the investment environment kind of writ large, the field is in a very good place.
And the whole issue, of prevalent disease versus rare disease, can you talk a little bit about, the industry currently and the targets? I mean, there's so much great promise there for treating a host of diseases, but in terms of, prevalent diseases versus rare diseases, how do you see that breaking down?
Yeah, I think we're hoping that this is going to be a record-breaking year for new approvals for gene therapies targeting rare diseases. And we know there's just huge unmet need in rare disease, and that we know that gene therapy and gene editing could be hugely impactful for, the majority of rare diseases that have no treatment at all. So we remain really excited about what this field can do for those patients and families suffering from rare diseases. That said, we do see more and more clinical development focused on more prevalent diseases. So, you probably have seen there's been some exciting clinical readouts in diabetes, for example. We've got member companies working on Parkinson's and having reported exciting news there. We've got companies working on cardiovascular indications, and even broader kind of those which might sort of technically be rare diseases, but are more prevalent rare diseases like hemophilia. So I think we are in the near term likely to see still the biggest impact and the biggest impact on the commercial market be in rare disease, but we can definitely see the field evolving to address prevalent diseases as well.
And so with all the potential, there's also challenges. And I know you participated in a panel at Bio 2022 earlier this month in San Diego. That session was on gene therapy. And one of the challenges that many of the panelists, including yourself, were talking about were in the area of manufacturing. Can you talk a little bit about manufacturing and what some of the hindrances are there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And it's absolutely the case that folks are highlighting manufacturing as an ongoing challenge. And there's lots of piece parts to that. I mean, one is simply hiring experienced manufacturing experts, right? There just aren't enough manufacturing experts to go around. So there's a real talent development need. There's also the need to appreciate that the manufacturing process in cell and gene therapy, I mean, it's quite different for cell and for gene, but is really often quite bespoke, and also creates regulatory challenges which are different than certainly traditional small molecule therapies. So ARM has tried to tackle that in a couple of ways. We developed something called AGene, which is a best practices guide to AAV gene therapy manufacturing. And that was modeled after a kind of sector-wide effort in the monoclonal antibody space a couple of decades ago, where the monoclonal antibody space was sort of in the same place that we feel like gene therapy is now, where you had a lot of people manufacturing these therapies. There wasn't yet quite standardization of technique or approach. And so there was a sort of inconsistent learning across the field, which has now evolved quite nicely. And I think we felt, and in talking with our regulators and our members, they also felt that there was just a need to kind of accelerate that best practice sharing across the field. So with the help of more than a dozen of our members and in collaboration with regulators, we put together this guide. It now serves as kind of a training tool, right? And we found that actually folks we've had a couple of requests to translate it or to use it in course curriculum. So we find that it's helpful to current members, it's helpful as a training guide, and hopefully will kind of allow folks to avoid mistakes that others have learned from in the past. We also are really deeply involved with members and regulators on kind of CMC regulatory requirements and frameworks, because we just know, we've seen that a number of the holdups of therapies coming to market have been the result of CMC challenges, questions raised by regulators and the like. And we just know this is a pain point between development and commercialization of these therapies. So through kind of specialized workshops on key topics, through dialogue with the agency around specific guidances and other approaches, we're really working closely with regulators and members to try to improve the CMC regulatory environment to really enhance its predictability so that we don't have kind of late development surprises in terms of therapies, making it to market.
And it's interesting, you mentioned, manufacturing expertise and, the need to hire, people who have experience, essentially, the workforce is critical. And so if there's gaps, the whole question of, how do you fill them? I think ARM is going to be conducting a workforce gaps analysis this year, if I'm not mistaken, and is looking at this issue.
That's right. It is, again, just something that comes up again and again in dialogue with companies. And we've thought kind of long and hard about what's the best way for us to help the field do this. And I think that the plan for this fall is to develop exactly what you've said, a workforce gaps analysis to really help the field as a whole understand where are there opportunities for development programs, where is there just a sort of information gap. And I think we hope to look at even some members have expressed some thinking they're doing around whether the requirements for particular roles are really grounded in necessity as opposed to just past practice. And so could we expand the labor pool by thinking a little bit more creatively about the skills that are needed for particular roles? But we'll be refining that outline and conducting that gap analysis in the second half of this year.
Yeah, that's an interesting point right there. The idea of, sort of reconsidering, what the academic credentials are that needed for these roles and, possibly a rethinking of, the education required for certain roles.
Absolutely. It's also, I think one of the interesting things in the manufacturing space too right now, Greg, is sort of the manufacturing investment strategy for companies, right? You'll know that there was a phase when part of the reason that the initial fundraising for a lot of these companies was as robust as it was because folks wanted to control their own manufacturing. They wanted to build out a big manufacturing facility and not be subject to the uncertain availability of manufacturing at a CDMO. I think there remain certainly some access challenges because of the growth of the field and the CDMO infrastructure trying to grow. But you also see companies trying to kind of evolve and maybe develop a different business structure for their manufacturing facility. So you saw the Homology deal recently and Atara, folks who had big manufacturing facilities and maybe decided the best way for them to really support the development of their program long haul was to enter into a partnership around those manufacturing facilities so that they still had access to it and had access to the expertise of the team that they had built up, but didn't necessarily have to carry the whole freight of having a manufacturing facility, given that the timing of the launch of therapies is pretty uncertain. And you've seen, you've got like places like the Center for Breakthrough Medicines and Resilience and kind of different business strategies evolving about how do you create, as just in time as possible, a manufacturing infrastructure as well as a talented team for these therapies. And, as you well know, that it's difficult to predict exactly the pace of one's development program. So I think folks are being pretty creative on the business structure side of manufacturing too.
Yeah. I saw a report earlier this month from CBRE. This came out at Bio 2022, but it basically said it's harder than ever for companies to hire, the kind of workforce talent that they need, despite the fact that record numbers of people are graduating, in the life sciences with degrees, advanced degrees. And so, I guess, maybe it's a little bit easier in, biotech hubs, big ones in, like Boston, the Bay Area. But for companies maybe in other parts of the country, it's a little bit more difficult to recruit.
On that point, we hear kind of different things, right? You'll hear folks in the biotech hubs complaining that they're just trading all the same people back and forth and paying them more every time they jump ship, right? They're still sort of a too small pool of talent, where sometimes we have a number of member companies in Ohio, for example, and I think folks there, although there's still not enough workers, sometimes when you get outside of a traditional hub, there's a little bit more stickiness. People don't move around quite as much, and there can be an advantage to being outside of a biotech hub. So I think it probably is kind of case specific. And I mean, the reality is, I think right now, the labor market is unlike anything most of us have seen in our careers, between sort of figuring out what is post-COVID workplace, what's hybrid, kind of people reevaluating what works best for them. I think you've got kind of biotech and cell and gene specific employment challenges in the context of what's a kind of a complicated labor market these days generally.
So changing here to policy, I mean, does ARM have certain, policy issues on its agenda this year that you could point to, things that are important to the industry and that you want to make sure, lawmakers in Washington and regulatory agencies are aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of what's been so rewarding at being at ARM for the last 5 years, and part of why it's really important, ARM's work is really important going forward, is that the policy environment still is not designed for these 21st century therapies in any shape or form. So to talk specifically about kind of what needs to change, we've talked some about the evolution of the regulatory environment and to address these CMC specifics. In Europe, we find on the regulatory front, we're challenged with a set of rules, GMO rules, for example, that are really affecting the ability to launch clinical trials that were all designed around GMO concerns in agriculture and really are not at all fit for purpose for gene therapies, and yet really slow down the process of developing gene therapies in Europe. In both Europe and the United States, one of the core policy challenges is around reimbursement and market access, that these therapies are just fundamentally different than chronic, pill a day, small molecule kind of therapies, in that, in many cases, they are highly durable, potentially curative, and the value is profound, but also kind of embodied in a one-time or a limited duration treatment. And so they can be quite expensive. And even where you can demonstrate that the therapy can pay back over time, health systems just are not, they're just not organized to account for that, either because they have annual budgeting or because patients transfer commercial insurance companies over the course of their life. They're just various components of kind of the modern healthcare system that make even absorbing a high value therapy that has profound benefits to patients and even can pencil over time into the healthcare system. So that's where we spend a lot of our time in the United States and in Europe. I should say, and I mentioned in this bio conference that you and I attended, that we do have a bit of a worry about the state of things in Europe these days. And part of that has to do with the policy environment in Europe, that we had seen traditionally that Europe was kind of the strong kind of secondary market for cell and gene therapies, both for the development of the therapies themselves, as well as their commercialization. And now we've seen, a couple of pretty high profile withdrawals from the European market. We were talking earlier today as a team about, almost a third of all the cell and gene therapies that have come to market in Europe have been withdrawn, in part because they cannot reach agreement with state payers to have what the companies consider a commercially viable product. So there are a couple of big decisions happening in Europe later this year. There's something called the pharma strategy that's being updated for the first time in 2 decades. There's regulation around the definition of ATMPs. There's a process underway to try to centralize and develop a common health technology assessment that could ease the process of bringing a therapy to market across all of the different member countries in the European Union. So all of those are pretty big, important decisions that taken together will either kind of set, I think, Europe on a positive trajectory in terms of continuing to be a leader in advanced therapies, or could really kind of set Europe on a path that makes the region less competitive in terms of these advanced therapies with the United States and Asia Pacific.
It's really interesting. I mean, the differences in the regulatory fronts in Europe versus the US. So we'll definitely continue to watch those situations as they develop. So after 5 years at the helm of ARM, what's next for you?
Yeah, I'm gonna take a little bit of a sabbatical. I have 2 almost college age kids. So one rising high school senior, and I want to get as much time with them this year as I can, and another kid who's trying to get on a college sports team, so needs lots of schlepping around and things like that. And I'm a horseback rider, and I have an aging show horse too that I'd like to get a little time with. So I'm going to kind of take advantage of the ability to address some of those things that are pretty time bound and get some time with my family here.
That sounds fantastic. Has ARM announced a successor yet?
No, we have not. The search process is well underway, however, and we have been really fortunate that there's a number of extremely strong candidates, and the search process is going very well. So I think it won't be too long before there's some news on that front.
Fantastic. Well, Janet, we wish you all the best for what comes next, and we'll continue to cover this industry, which, I mean, there's so much excitement around the potential for these therapeutics. It's amazing. So again, we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to work with you, and thanks for all the good work you're doing to try to kind of elucidate the dynamics of this really interesting field. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.